The wind howled through the canyons that afternoon, carrying with it the scent of dust and pine needles. Sarah Whitlock pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she guided her mule along the narrow trail. She had no real reason to wander this far from her cabin, except that the silence of her home sometimes pressed too heavy on her chest. Solitude was both her shelter and her prison, and on days like this, she sought distraction in the wild places where no one dared follow. The sky threatened rain, but she pressed on, drawn by an unease she could not name. Her boots crunched over loose gravel as she passed the jagged mouth of an unfamiliar cave. Something made her pause. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, a faint sound half swallowed by stone. Then she heard it again, a muffled groan, weak and strained, the kind only a wounded creature could make. Her heart hammered. Every instinct screamed to turn back. Caves could house mountain lions or outlaws. But the sound tugged at her, a thread she couldn't ignore. She slipped the rifle from her shoulder and crept forward, her breath shallow, her pulse echoing in her ears. Inside, the air was cool and damp. Shafts of light slanted through cracks above, illuminating the rough walls. She stepped cautiously, scanning every shadow. Then, in the farthest corner, she saw him dot an Apache warrior, bound hand and foot, slumped against the rock. His dark hair hung loose and matted, his chest streaked with dried blood where his shirt had been torn open. A cruel gag cut across his mouth, leaving his breaths ragged and shallow. His skin glistened with fever. Sarah froze. Her neighbor's warnings rang in her head. Never trust an Apache. If you see one, you ride the other way. Yet here was no raider, no threat, only a man broken, discarded like a carcass. Whoever had done this had left him to die slowly in the dark. Their eyes met. Even weakened, his gaze pierced her, fierce and unyielding, but beneath it flickered something else, desperation. She tightened her grip on the rifle, torn between fear and pity. "You'll get yourself killed," she whispered to herself. But her feet moved anyway. She lowered the weapon and knelt. The stench of blood and sweat filled her nostrils as she studied the knots biting into his wrists. Rope burns had carved raw grooves into his flesh. She hesitated only a moment longer before, drawing the hunting knife from her boot. The blade sliced through the ropes, one by one, until his arms fell limp at his sides. He sagged forward, his strength spent, and Sarah caught his shoulder to steady him. Heat radiated from his skin. Fever was already setting in. Removing the gag, she offered the only comfort she had, a canteen of water. He drank greedily, then coughed, his breath rattling. She didn't understand his words, low and hoarse in a tongue foreign to her, but she caught the gratitude in his eyes. Sarah knew the danger. If anyone discovered her here, helping him, she would be branded a traitor to her people. Yet she also knew she could not leave him. To abandon him in this cave would make her no better than those who had tied him here. With effort, she managed to haul him upright. He leaned heavily against her, his frame towering over hers even in weakness, yet his weight was that of a dying man. Bit by bit, she guided him out of the cave. Her mule waiting at the trailhead. Rain began to fall, a slow drizzle that dampened the earth and carried away the dust. Sarah lifted her eyes to the gray sky. She didn't know why she was doing this, only that she could not stop. This man had been cast aside by the world, and in him she saw the echo of her own loneliness. That day, in the hidden recess of a canyon, a lone woman chose defiance over fear. She freed a stranger, an enemy by name, but something more in truth, a soul bound as tightly as her own. And though she did not yet realize it, her decision to lead him out of that cave was the first step toward a home neither of them had dared hope for. By the time Sarah reached her cabin, the rain had turned steady, soaking through her shawl and dripping from the mule's mane. The Apache warrior swayed in the saddle, his head lolling with exhaustion, and she feared more than once that he would slide to the ground before they reached safety. but stubbornness held him upright, and perhaps that was what struck her most, that a man so close to death still clung to life with teeth and claws. Her cabin was small, built by her late husband with rough-hewn logs and a stone hearth. It was not much, but it was hers, and for years it had held only her silence. Now, as she dragged the warrior inside and lowered him onto her bed, the space felt different, charged with something she couldn't name. He tried to rise, his pride resisting the weakness in his body, but she placed a firm hand on his chest. "Stay still," she ordered softly. "You'll tear yourself apart." He didn't understand her words. She knew, yet the authority in her tone seemed to reach him. Slowly, his rigid muscles eased, though his eyes never left her face. Sarah fetched a basin of water warmed at the hearth, tore strips from an old sheet, and began cleaning his wounds. Some gashes were shallow, others deep, but all had been left untended for too long. Dried blood came away in dark flakes. Angry welts told of brutal handling. Each time the cloth pressed against torn skin, his jaw tightened, but he did not cry out. "You're lucky," she murmured, more to herself than him. "Another day and the fever would have carried you off." When she pressed a cup of willow bark tea to his lips, he hesitated. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. Did he think she meant to poison him? For a moment she saw the warrior behind the suffering, proud, wary, a man who had learned not to trust. She raised the cup to her own lips, sipping first, then held it out again. This time he drank. The language between them was not spoken, but it existed in glances, gestures, the small acts of care and the guarded acceptance of them. That first night, he tossed and muttered in a fever dream, words spilling in his own tongue. Sarah sat at his side, dabbing his brow with a damp cloth, whispering comfort, though he could not understand. His suffering stirred something inside her she thought long dead. Once she had cared for someone like this, her husband, only to watch sickness claim him despite her efforts. Since then she had sworn never again to feel the ache of attachment. But here she was, heart caught in the snare of a stranger's labored breath. When dawn broke, the fever broke with it. He opened his eyes, dark, steady, aware. Sarah caught herself smiling with relief, then quickly hid it behind a mask of composure. As the days passed, strength returned to him slowly. He could sit, then stand, then walk the perimeter of the cabin. Though he spoke little, she understood. His action said enough. He fetched water from the creek, split logs for the hearth, and repaired the loose hinge on her door. It was not debt he repaid, but dignity he reclaimed piece by piece, as though proving he was more than the broken figure she had found in that cave. Sarah, watching him, felt her solitude crack. She found herself talking aloud again, at first simple instructions, then stories from her past. She told him of the little farm she had tried to keep alive, of the husband buried beneath a cottonwood tree, of nights when loneliness pressed so hard she thought her heart might split. She didn't know if he understood, but his steady gaze told her he listened. And somehow, that was enough. In turn, he began to say words tentative, halting, the edges of English shaped with his accent. She learned his true name was difficult for her tongue, but she whispered it anyway, cherishing the sound. Still, she also began to call him by a name of her own, a simple one that felt right on her lips, a name that restored humanity where cruelty had tried to strip it away. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. The silence was broken by the crack of an axe, the shuffle of footsteps, the quiet rhythm of two people sharing space. For the first time in years, Sarah felt she was not living only for herself. She had saved him from death, but in some quiet, unspoken way, he had saved her too. The days settled into a rhythm neither Sarah nor the Apache warrior had expected. At first, silence ruled between them, thick, cautious, the kind that could either fracture or slowly turn into trust. But silence was not new to Sarah. She had lived with it so long she could read its nuances. And now, she discovered, silence with him felt different. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence. In the early mornings, when the mist still hung over the meadow, she would find him already awake, sitting on the step of the cabin, sharpening a stick or scanning the horizon as if guarding the small homestead. His posture was proud, his gaze watchful, and though words were scarce, Sarah felt oddly safe knowing he kept watch. At first, he worked only in short bursts, fetching water, stacking kindling, clearing brush from the garden patch. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if every act of labor was a declaration that he still belonged to the living. Sarah tried to help, but he would shake his head, gently insisting through gesture that some tasks were his alone. Their shared meals became the quiet heart of each day. Sarah would ladle stew into 2 bowls and sit across from him at the table her husband once built. He ate with calm restraint, never wasting a scrap, never asking for more. Sometimes she would speak of weather, of crops, of small memories that spilled out before she could stop them. He seldom answered, but his steady gaze never wavered, and she realized how rare it was to be truly listened to. Neighbors occasionally rode past her land, suspicion sharp in their eyes. Sarah knew what they thought of her already. A strange widow, too bold for living alone, too quiet to trust. If they guessed she was harboring an Apache in her cabin, trouble would come quick and merciless. Each time riders passed, the warrior melted into the shadows, moving soundlessly, waiting until hoofbeats faded before emerging again. She hated the fear that knotted her stomach in those moments, yet she hated more the thought of sending him away. One evening, while mending a torn shirt of his, Sarah caught him watching her hands. He reached across the table, hesitated, then touched the needle and thread as if recognizing the patience it required. He spoke a word in his language, slow, low. She repeated it awkwardly, earning the faintest curve of his mouth almost a smile. Encouraged, she asked for more words, fumbling through sounds until he chuckled, the sound startling them both. It was the first laughter to touch the cabin in years. Sarah began calling him by the simple name she had given him, Stone, for the steadiness in his eyes, for the way he endured. At first, he did not react, but over time he began to answer to it, even as he taught her fragments of his true name. Names became their fragile bridge, the first rope strung between 2 distant shores. Nights were hardest. When storms rolled through and the wind rattled the shutters, Sarah often lay awake, her mind dragged back to memories of loss and fear. She thought she was quiet, but more than once she noticed him glance her way as if sensing the weight on her chest. Without a word, he would place another log on the fire, keeping the hearth warm until dawn. It was a simple gesture, yet one that spoke volumes. Slowly, Sarah realized she was no longer moving through her days alone. The cabin breathed differently now. Chores were lighter with 2 sets of hands. Meals tasted richer when shared. And silence, once oppressive, had become a companionable space where trust could take root. One morning, as she watched him repair the fence with deliberate strength, Sarah felt something stir deep within her. It was not yet love, but it was its beginning, a bond forming from the quiet labor of survival, the unspoken acknowledgement that 2 broken souls had found a rhythm together. She no longer saw him as the stranger she had rescued in a cave. He was becoming something more, part of her days, part of her home, part of her life. And though no words named it yet, Sarah knew that a bond stronger than silence was taking shape between them. Autumn crept across the land, painting the cottonwoods in gold and rust. Sarah noticed the change most in the evenings, how the air grew sharp, how the shadows lengthened across the meadow. The Apache warrior, still healing but stronger each day, worked beside her without complaint. They rarely spoke beyond the fragments of shared language they had built, yet the silence between them had begun to feel less like a wall and more like a hearth fire, steady, warming, familiar, but shadows lingered in both their hearts. shadows that could not be ignored forever. One evening, as Sarah sat by the hearth mending a pair of her late husband's trousers for the warrior to wear, she found herself telling him a story she had never spoken aloud. Her voice was low, almost uncertain, as though releasing the words might make them too real. "My husband, James." She paused, swallowing hard. "He was a good man. Tried to give me a home, tried to build something out here. But fever doesn't care how hard a man works. It came for him one winter and left me with nothing but this cabin." The warrior sat across from her, sharpening a knife against a whetstone. His dark eyes lifted, watching her. He did not interrupt. He only listened, the steady rhythm of stone against steel slowing as if giving space to her grief. "I buried him under this cottonwood," she continued, her throat tight. "I thought maybe I'd follow him before long. Some days I wanted to. But the land kept me alive and maybe stubbornness too. I told myself it was better to live alone than to feel that kind of loss again." Her voice trembled at the last words, and she bent quickly back to her stitching, ashamed of the tears that burned her eyes. She had not meant to reveal so much, but something about the quiet strength in his presence loosened the knots she had tied around her memories. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in halting English, he spoke a phrase she didn't recognize at first. He repeated it slowly, his voice low and gravelly. "I was taken." Her hand stilled. She raised her head, watching as he tapped his chest with the flat of his hand. "My people, gone. Enemies take me. Chains, years." His expression hardened, and he mimed binding his wrists. Sarah felt the air thicken. She could see it now, the rope burns that had scarred his flesh, the haunted flicker in his gaze when shadows moved too quickly, the way he flinched at sudden noises. He was not just a warrior abandoned in a cave. He was a man who had lived through captivity, through betrayal she could only imagine. "They leave me to die," he finished, voice flat. Eyes dark with memory. Her chest ached at the weight of his confession. They were two souls carved by loss, bound not just by circumstance but by the wounds of the past. For the first time, Sarah reached across the table. Her hand hovered before finally resting on his. His skin was rough, scarred, but warm. "You're not alone now," she whispered, not knowing if he understood the words but hoping he understood the intent. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and nodded once. The simple gesture felt heavier than 1,000 words. From that night on, the shadows of their pasts no longer seemed like secrets pressing against their ribs. Instead, they became something shared, a bridge built from pain as much as from trust. Sarah began to notice the warrior sleeping easier, his brow less furrowed by dreams. And she, too, found herself breathing more freely, as if naming her grief had loosened its grip. They were still strangers in many ways, but the truth of their wounds had bound them together. Out on the lonely frontier, where survival often demanded hardness of heart, Sarah and the Apache warrior found strength in revealing the broken pieces instead. In doing so, they discovered something neither had dared hope for: healing. Winter's breath crept down from the mountains, dusting the ridges with white and sending icy winds across the plains. Sarah had always dreaded this season, when loneliness weighed heavier than snow and the cabin walls felt more like a cage. But this year, things were different. The Apache warrior stone, as she called him, was no longer a patient struggling to recover, but a presence woven into the rhythm of her days. His strength had returned in full, and with it, an energy that reshaped the life she had known, stone-built without needing to be asked. One morning, Sarah woke to find him already outside, repairing the roof with fresh-cut pine shingles. Another day, he reinforced the corral so her mule would be better sheltered. The cabin, once worn and weary, was beginning to take on new life, stronger, sturdier, as if reflecting the changes stirring within its walls. Sarah tried to contribute as she always had, cooking and tending the small garden that had somehow survived autumn. But Stone would often take her tools from her hands and insist on doing the hardest labor himself. When she frowned, he would tilt his head and say, in halting English, "You? Too small. Let me." His words, clumsy but earnest, drew laughter from her, the kind that surprised her every time it escaped her lips. It wasn't just the work he did, but the way he moved through her home as though he belonged there. He carried water in from the creek, stacked wood by the hearth, even began carving small wooden bowls during quiet evenings by the fire. Sarah found herself watching him more often than she admitted, how his broad shoulders bent to the task, how his hands, scarred and rough, shaped wood with patience. But it wasn't only the practical tasks that filled her days with new warmth. There were small moments, unspoken and tender, that stitched something deeper between them. One evening, Sarah burned her hand on the kettle, yanking it from the stove too quickly. She hissed in pain, cradling her palm. Stone was at her side before she could protest, taking her hand gently in his. His touch was firm yet careful, and when he pressed a cool cloth against the burn, his eyes softened in a way that made her chest ache. He said something low in his language. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Comfort, reassurance. Another night, as the wind howled outside and rattled the shutters, Sarah startled awake from a dream. She sat up, breath quick, the cabin cloaked in darkness. Before she could steady herself, she saw him by the fire, adding wood to the flames. He turned, caught her gaze, and gave a small nod. He hadn't slept. He had stayed awake to watch the fire, to keep the cold from creeping in, to make sure she felt safe. Their lives were becoming intertwined, not just in necessity but in choice. She found herself speaking to him more, explaining things in English, pointing at objects until he repeated the words back. His progress was slow but steady, and in return he taught her fragments of his own language. Sometimes they laughed at each other's clumsy attempts. Sometimes they simply repeated until the sounds fit more naturally on their tongues. Sarah began to feel something she had not known in years: partnership. No longer did she carry every burden alone. No longer did she eat in silence. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness, it pulsed with life, with two heartbeats moving in rhythm. One afternoon, as they stood side by side splitting firewood, Sarah realized that the dread she usually felt at winter's approach had not come. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet peace. The world outside might still be harsh, and whispers of danger might circle from neighbors or strangers, but within her walls, she had something she had not thought possible: a home shared, a life mending, and though she dared not name it yet, she knew the bond between her and Stone was no longer just survival. It was belonging. The first signs of trouble came with the sound of hooves on the frozen ground. Sarah had grown used to the rhythm of her own days with Stone, the scrape of the axe splitting wood, the hiss of stew simmering on the stove, the quiet comfort of two people working side by side. But when riders appeared on the horizon, everything shifted. It was late afternoon when she saw them. 3 men from the settlement, neighbors of a kind, though they had never called her a friend. They reined in near her fence line, eyes sharp beneath the brims of their hats. Sarah's heart tightened. She knew the look of men who had come with suspicion, not goodwill. Stone sensed it too. He had been carrying water from the creek but stopped in his tracks, his body taut, every muscle ready. In one fluid motion, he set the bucket down and melted into the shadows of the barn, silent as smoke. "Afternoon, Miss Whitlock," the lead rider called. His voice was too casual, his smile too thin. "Been a spell since we saw you in town." Sarah forced a polite nod. "I keep busy here." The man's gaze swept over her yard, lingering on the tools, the neat stacks of firewood, the sturdiness of her cabin. "Funny thing," he said, Word's gone around that you've had some help lately. Strange, for a woman who likes to keep to herself. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression steady. I've managed just fine on my own. The second rider spat into the dirt. Folks say they've seen tracks. Moccasin tracks. Apache. His tone was sharp, testing. That true? Sarah's throat tightened. She felt the weight of the rifle leaning just inside her door, the weight of the secret she had chosen to carry. A single slip could condemn them both. I don't know what folks think they've seen, she said firmly. Tracks can belong to anyone. Hunters, trappers, passing strangers. The third man leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. Or maybe you're hiding something you shouldn't. You know what those savages do. You know what they've done to good families around here. His words cut sharper than the wind, but Sarah held her ground. All I know, she said, voice cool, is that this is my land. And who comes or goes here is no one's business but mine. A tense silence followed. The men shifted in their saddles, measuring her resolve. Finally, the leader tipped his hat with mock politeness. We'll be keeping watch, Miss Whitlock. Just remember where your loyalties lie. They turned and rode off, the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. Sarah let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling. From the barn's shadow, Stone emerged, his face set in hard lines. He had understood enough. She could see it in his eyes, the awareness of danger, the readiness to leave if it meant keeping her safe. No, she said quickly, reading his intent. You don't go. He tilted his head, searching her face. Danger, for you? Yes, she admitted, voice breaking. But I won't hand you over to them. I won't live that way. For a long moment, they stood in the fading light, two figures bound by an unspoken pact. Then Stone nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. Together, they would face whatever came. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind batter the shutters. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it burned something fiercer, defiance. The world beyond her fence line might see an outlaw, an enemy, but she saw the truth. Stone was no threat. He was the man who had given her back a home, and if outsiders wanted to tear that away, they would have to come through her first. Morning came gray and brittle, the sky heavy with snow that refused to fall. Sarah's unease from the night before had not faded. It sat in her chest like a stone. She tried to keep her hands busy feeding the mule, kneading dough, tending the fire, but her mind kept circling back to the writer's words. We'll be keeping watch. By midday, her fear became flesh. The crunch of boots on frozen ground jolted her from her work. When she stepped onto the porch, two of the same men from yesterday stood there, rifles slung casually in their hands. Behind them, the third leaned against his horse, eyes mean as a rattler's. Morning, Miss Whitlock, the leader drawled. We've come to make sure you're not keeping dangerous company. We'll just take a look around. Her stomach lurched. Stone was inside, near the hearth. If they forced their way in, discovery would be certain. You'll do no such thing, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. This is my land. You've no right. The second man smirked. When it comes to Apaches, we've every right. They're killers, thieves. If you're sheltering one, that makes you no better. The third shifted his rifle forward, not quite aiming, but threatening. Step aside, miss. Before Sarah could answer, the cabin door opened. Stone stepped out into the cold, silent but unflinching, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, locked on the men with a warrior's calm. God Almighty, one muttered. She really is hiding one. The leader raised his rifle, quick as a whip crack. Back away, savage. No. Sarah shouted, rushing forward. She planted herself between the barrel and Stone's chest, her arms spread wide. If you fire, you'll have to kill me first. The air went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sarah. Stone's voice was low, almost pleading, though his English was limited. He touched her shoulder as if to pull her back, but she stood firm. The men stared. Disbelief painted across their faces. "You've lost your mind," the leader hissed. "He's got you fooled. Once you turn your back, he'll slit your throat. You don't know him," she said fiercely. "You don't know what was done to him, how he was left to die. He is no threat. He is a man, and he's under my protection." Her words hung heavy in the frozen air. She had said it aloud, claimed him as hers before men who would spit on the thought. The leader's jaw worked, his eyes darting between her defiant stance and the silent figure behind her. Finally, with a curse, he jerked his head toward his men. "Mount up. She's not worth the trouble." For now, they backed away, but their glares promised this wasn't the end. Within minutes, the sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the pounding of Sarah's heartbeat in her ears. When the silence settled, she turned to Stone. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something fierce, something more than gratitude. "You stayed," he said slowly, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "For me, yes," she breathed. Her knees trembled, and she sank onto the porch rail, shaking. "I couldn't let them take you. Not after everything." Stone crouched before her, his hand covering hers. His grip was strong, grounding her. "You? Brave," he said. "Heart, strong." Tears pricked her eyes, hot against the cold air. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the weight of her choices not as a burden, but as a declaration of who she was. She had chosen him over fear, over safety, over the judgment of neighbors. That night, as the snow finally fell in heavy silence, Sarah and Stone sat by the fire together. Outside, the world was hostile, but inside, loyalty bound them closer than ever. And in that fragile warmth, Sarah knew she would stand against the world itself if it meant keeping him by her side. The days after the writer's visit were heavy with silence, but within that silence, something new began to grow. Sarah found herself watching Stone with fresh eyes. Every movement of his hands, whether smoothing a plank of wood or tracing the edge of her old sewing table, carried a sense of purpose. He was a man remaking himself, piece by piece, and yet he remained nameless like a story half told. One morning, as dawn spilled pale light across the valley, Sarah sat on the porch steps with a steaming cup of coffee. Stone emerged from the barn carrying a bundle of split logs. The air smelled of pine and smoke, sharp with winter's edge. He set the wood down neatly, then looked at her with quiet expectation, as though waiting for something she had not yet spoken. "Stone," she said softly, testing the name she had given him weeks ago when he was still more stranger than companion. "I've been thinking. It's not right that you go on without a true name. You deserve one of your own, not just what I've called you." He tilted his head, his dark eyes catching the light. "Name is life," he said slowly, his English halting but clear. "You give?" Her chest tightened. She had not realized until this moment how much the question mattered not only to him, but to herself. She thought of the strength in his silence, the way he had stood by her when others would have left, the way he had begun to carve a place for himself in her lonely world. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of it. "I want to give you one." She rose and stepped closer, her hand brushing the rough fabric of his shirt. "I'll call you Daniel." The name felt steady, like the earth under her feet. "It means God is my judge. And it means you're no longer a man bound in shadows. You're a man with a future." For a long moment he stood still, his eyes searching hers. Then he touched his chest lightly, repeating, "Daniel." He smiled an unguarded, gentle smile that softened every line of his face. "Name good. From you?" "Good." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. She hadn't realized how deeply she'd needed to speak his new life into being. In that instant, he was no longer just the warrior she had freed. He was the man she had chosen to keep. Then, with a quiet certainty, Daniel placed his hand over hers. He spoke a word in Apache, low and reverent, a word that rolled like music from his tongue. "What does it mean?" she asked, breathless. His smile deepened. "It means Morning Star for you." The name struck her like a prayer. In his language, she was no longer just Sarah Whitlock, the forgotten widow on the edge of the settlement. To him, she was light after darkness, the first sign of hope at dawn. They stood together in the cool morning air, names newly spoken, lives newly bound. And in the naming, something unshakable had been born, a promise neither of them would ever walk this world alone again. The days that followed the naming brought a change neither Sarah nor Daniel could deny. The cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, now rang with the quiet rhythm of shared work and laughter that came softly, almost shyly, from their lips. Daniel, though still healing, set himself to tasks with a steady determination. He reinforced the cabin walls against winter's winds, patched the roof where snow threatened to seep through, and carved new handles for the tools Sarah had long since given up on repairing. She watched in quiet awe as her home, weathered and weary like herself, grew stronger under his hands. Sarah, in turn, taught him what she knew of keeping house: how to mend torn cloth, cook stews that simmered rich and warm, and tend the small garden that clung to life behind the cabin. Though his large hands fumbled with needles and seeds, he met her instruction with patience, often flashing her that gentle, boyish smile when the results were crooked but earnest. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, watching the sky bleed into shades of purple and gold. Sarah read aloud from her worn Bible, her voice low and steady, while Daniel listened, sometimes repeating the words to strengthen his grasp of English. At other times he spoke softly in his own tongue, sharing stories of rivers and mountains, of warriors and spirits. Though she could not understand the words, she felt their weight. The history carried in every syllable. It was during those nights Sarah realized that their lives had begun to weave together. No longer was she the widow eking out survival on the edge of the frontier. She was part of something living, something growing. Daniel's presence filled spaces in her heart she had long ago sealed shut, and she sensed that she had given him more than shelter, she had given him belonging. Yet not all was simple. The settlement still eyed her with suspicion, whispers floating whenever she passed through town. Some said she was foolish, others claimed she was traitorous for keeping an Apache under her roof. But Sarah no longer shrank from their stares. With Daniel at her side, carrying her supplies or standing silently as a shield against their judgment, she found a courage she thought she had lost forever. The land, too, seemed to recognize the shift. Crops that had once struggled now sprouted greener. The cabin felt warmer, the air lighter. Together, they built not just shelter, but a home. One evening, as Sarah set a loaf of bread upon the table and Daniel placed a hand upon hers, she realized with startling clarity that she no longer lived for yesterday's grief. She lived for tomorrow with him. Winter crept upon the valley, laying a soft hush over the land. The cabin, once a refuge of sorrow, now glowed with warmth. Yet beneath the peace Sarah and Daniel had built, a question lingered like smoke that refused to clear. What would come next? One morning, a small band of Apaches appeared at the edge of the clearing. Their presence was cautious but firm, their eyes fixed on Daniel with a recognition Sarah could not read. The leader spoke in their tongue, words flowing sharp and strong. Daniel's face shifted, surprise, longing, and grief flickering in the space of a breath. Sarah's heart clenched. She knew what this meant. His people had found him. They had come to take him back. Inside, by the fire, Daniel sat in silence while Sarah busied herself with meaningless tasks, wiping a table that was already clean, stoking a flame that burned bright. She could not meet his gaze. Finally, he spoke. They asked me to return. To my blood, my people. His voice was steady, but his hands clenched tight on his knees. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. It's what you've waited for. To go home. He looked at her then, eyes deep as the canyon. This is home, her breath caught. She shook her head, torn between hope and fear. Daniel, I don't want to keep you from what you've lost. From who you are. He reached across the space between them, his hand closing over hers. You gave me name. You gave me life again. My people are in my blood, but you... He paused, searching for the words. You are my heart. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as he rose and stepped toward the door. For a moment she thought he would leave, but instead he walked past the threshold, out into the clearing. Facing the waiting Apaches, Daniel raised his voice in their tongue. His words rang firm, resolute. When he returned, Sarah stood frozen by the hearth. What did you tell them? She whispered, that I stay. My path is here. Relief washed over her, sharp and overwhelming. She rushed to him, and in that moment the last of her fears broke. His arms wrapped around her, strong and certain, and she knew his choice was not made out of obligation but out of love. Outside, snowflakes began to fall, soft as blessings from the sky. Together they stood in the doorway of their cabin, not a widow and a wanderer anymore, but two souls who had chosen each other against the weight of the world. Their story had begun in darkness, in a cave where chains bound his body and sorrow bound her spirit. But now, with names spoken, futures chosen, and hearts united, they faced the coming days not as broken people, but as a family.